Broken Dreams. A Paranormal Protector Tale. Book 3 in the Heart of Stone series. Written by Demelza, Carlton. Autonarrated by AI Charlotte from Google. 1. I declare you guilty of the murder of Lady Pamela Burke, and sentence you to be hanged by the neck, until dead. For any normal man, or any murderer, those words should have signaled the end of his story. But for Ben and his brothers, who were not guilty of Pamela's murder, no matter what the magistrate said, it was but the beginning of a new chapter, a twist in the tale as it were, because in Ben's experience, fate always had other plans. As did the prison superintendent. I do not like that shirt. The collar points are too high, and my cravat is tied all wrong for the current fashion. I insist you change it more like so. The superintendent lifted his chin so that Ben might better see how his cravat was tied today. Ben nodded gravely. Yes, sir. But I will need a new canvas and more paint, to properly capture your likeness anew. As always, I am at your service, sir. He bowed deeply, almost like a gentleman or perhaps a gentleman's valet, though he was neither. Then you shall have it. I must have a portrait that portrays me perfectly. The superintendent rang the bell with violence more in keeping with his reputation, as the hard man in charge of a prison filled with the worst offenders in Scotland. Alan, he bellowed. Alan, the superintendent's manservant, appeared after a short moment. Yes, sir? He pointedly ignored Ben as usual. Prisoners were beneath his notice. I want you to order more canvas and paints for stone here. Immediately, the superintendent said. Yes, sir. His bow wasn't as low as Ben's had been, which made the superintendent frown. Forgive me, sir, but a messenger arrived with an urgent letter. Alan held out the missive, his thumb carefully placed over the wax seal so as to hide it from Ben's view. Ben hid a smile. He didn't care a whit for the superintendent's correspondence, but he'd hear about it soon enough, for the man liked to talk while Ben painted. Usually about the latest fashions in London, for the man was definitely a dandy of the most passionate kind, but on rare occasions he talked of other things. Sure enough, the superintendent snatched the letter from his servant's hand and dismissed him. Ben added a few brush strokes to his painting while he waited, knowing that the superintendent would change his mind on the morrow, and wished to keep this one as well as anything else he commanded Ben to create. Finally, the superintendent made a derisive sound and threw the letter down on the table. Do you know what foolishness the high and mighty in London are up to this time? Some strange new fashion, most likely. Ben allowed his eyes to widen in surprise. Me? No, sir. They seem to think that there are good men in prison, hard workers, and not just criminals. They want me to find any man trained in the building trades, stonemasonry, brickwork, carpentry and the like, so they might transport them to the Swan River colony to build things. This was definitely an improvement over the latest way to tie a cravat. Hope gave a feeble flap within Ben's breast. Indeed, sir. The superintendent laughed. They have even offered a reward for every felon transported. He grew thoughtful. Do you know of any prisoners who might satisfy my superiors? Even one man? Ben pretended to think hard, then said slowly, I can only think of 3 men, sir. My brothers Torsten and Dunstan are a master stonemason and a ship's carpenter, respectively, and then there's me. I was training as an apprentice stonemason with my brother Torsten, until I was arrested. I would have finished my apprenticeship by now and be a full mason. But I cannot think of any other man who might satisfy you, sir. The superintendent's brow furrowed. But you 3 are sentenced to hang, and I want my new portrait painted. Then again, there is the reward, and saving the cost of the hangman. Ben remained silent. He knew the man's vanity and greed warred for supremacy, but he also knew greed always won, for the more coin the superintendent had, the more he could pay his tailor. I suppose it's a fate worse than death, being sent to the Swan River colony. I've heard stories of men starving, killed by natives or wild animals. The soils are so stained in blood, they are permanently red. Nary a woman to be seen, for it is not safe for them, either. With the reward, I might hire a proper painter too. Ben tried to look worried while his heart soared. Fate was smiling on him in her twisted way. If he had to choose between working blood-stained foreign soil or rotting in this prison, he wouldn't hesitate. Oh sir, that sounds terrible. Perhaps if you were to forget I spoke. I'd much rather stay here than be sent to the colonies. It sounds positively frightful. Ah, there it was. The superintendent's sadistic smile, when he thought he was being particularly cruel. Then you shall go to the colonies, Stone. You and your brothers. Perhaps you can pay for your crimes there with your lives instead of being a plague upon good men here. And I shall be able to pay a real painter to paint my portrait. The superintendent summoned a guard to take Ben back to his cell. Ben dragged his feet, hanging his head, but secretly his heart was lighter than air, for his dearest wish was about to be granted. 2. When Ben was only a wee lad, his father would take him and his brothers down to the Firth of Clyde, and he'd point out to sea, where the Kintyre Peninsula ended, and he'd say that fate awaited them out there. Ben and his brothers would peer out at the Irish Sea, straining their eyes to see through the mists, tasting the salt from the waves rocking the boat beneath them, and he swore he could almost taste the future his father promised. Mother's brother, Uncle Stanley, who had gone to the Swan River colony before Ben was born, had sent a letter from those faraway southern shores, and father would quote from it. How Fremantle was like the cliffs of Dover, white sand and stone, topped with green enough to feed as many sheep and cattle as they could imagine, and on the shore as much seaweed as a man could want to fertilize his fields, just piled up on the beach, waiting for them. All his life, Ben had wanted to believe father's tales of this land where fortune waited for them, if they were only bold enough to follow her. Even now, in the pre-dawn light, waiting for the sun to rise over the town of Fremantle so that they'd finally be allowed to go ashore, he dared to hope, even as he told himself it was all a fairy story, the sort of fanciful tale told to children to give them exactly this kind of false hope. Yet when the sun rose over those white buildings, blessing them with her rosy glow, Ben could have sworn he was still dreaming. The taste of salt stung his cracked lips as he beheld the limestone cliffs, sheering off to his left, while the waves played between the ship and the shore, licking one and then the other, not sure which one it liked the taste of best. If he listened hard, he could even hear the waves whispering to the sand as they caressed it like an army of lovers, one after the other. The waves might touch the ship as if forced by duty, but what they really loved was the land. Just like Uncle Stanley apparently, also father had said. Just as Ben meant to if this land would only let him. It seemed like scarcely a moment before the sun was high in the sky, and he and his brothers were rowing ashore, shoulder to shoulder with the other convicts. For all the stories of being clapped in irons and chain gangs that he'd heard along the way, it was almost like being a free man again, headed home instead of into the unknown. Until one of the waves splashed over the side of the boat, and the water was warm. Back home the sea would be near freezing, but here it was like a bath. Stanley had been right then. The Swan River colony truly was paradise. But convicts were not meant to enjoy the view, they were here to work, the guards reminded them as they ordered them to unload the boats and carry the cargo into the 3-story warehouse on the edge of the beach. Inside the warehouse, the floor was damp beach sand, littered with seaweed, but the guards wanted the convicts to carry the cargo inside and lay them on top of the other soaked sacks and chests. For while the warehouse walls might be finished outside, there was nothing inside, no floors or walls or stairs. Tor and Dunstan did not approve, muttering under their breath about the foolishness of bringing anything in here, only to have it ruined, when it was clear from the timber and ballast stacked outside, ready to be loaded aboard ships, that things would be safer outside, beneath the cloudless skies. Ben listened to them for long enough to know what they thought they should do, before he caught the eye of one of the guards he'd helped in the shipboard school. "Sir, do you know why this warehouse is not finished?" Ben asked as he passed, careful not to break stride as he lifted a sack onto each shoulder and carried them off the beach. "Not enough labor, lad." "That's what you're here for," the guard said. Ben nodded thoughtfully. "So that's why my brothers were talking about using that timber to build stairs and upper levels, and those ballast flagstones to raise the floor above the sand." He pulled a pencil and notepad from his pocket, and began to sketch what Dunstan had described. "Something like this, sir?" With a few lines, he was done, and he tore off the page to hand it to the guard. Ben had dallied too long, one of the colony guards had noticed, and was headed over to chastise him for slowing in his work. The other guard quickly hushed him and showed him the sketch, as Ben hurried to lift another sack. By nightfall, they'd begun winching sacks from the sand up to the boards on Dunstan's newly constructed landing. By the end of the week, the landing was a complete first floor with a second underway, and Tor had started laying Yorkshire flagstones on the sand below. He'd even heard Mr. Henderson suggesting to Mr. Ray, his first officer, that they might even be able to extend the commissariat according to the original plans, if the productivity continued at this pace. For that was the fancy name of the warehouse, which towered over most of the other buildings in Fremantle, with the exception of the roundhouse at the top of the cliffs at Arthur Head. So when Ben lay down beside his brothers, all in their hammocks strung up in a row in the much less salubrious warehouse known as Scott Buildings, a short distance along the beach, he had the satisfaction of knowing that they might be convicts, but they were helping to construct the Swan River colony, and on their way to earning a ticket of leave or perhaps even a pardon, when they'd be free to seek out their own fortunes, exactly as father had dreamed all those years ago. In the meantime, he meant to keep his head down and do as he was told. At least he retired with a bellyful of bread and soup every night, which was more than he'd had in the prison in Scotland. And while hanging by the neck until dead was still a threat, when he lay in his hammock in the warm night air, the chill grasp of death around his throat seemed as distant as faraway Scotland. 3. "I can help you escape," a soft voice said, though it carried all the way across the road, for the man who must have spoken stood before a butcher's shop with his arms folded across his apron, clearly the proprietor of the place. Ben's brothers ignored him, Dunstan because he was too busy trying to keep Tor on his manacled feet, while Tor swayed, blood from last night's lashes seeping through his party-colored slops. As if the lashing wasn't punishment enough, he was forced to dress like some medieval jester and work as hard as anyone else while wearing chains. All for telling the truth, that the prison walls the engineers had designed would fall over in the first winter storm. Ben should have spoken to the guards instead. Not Torsten. It still might not have done any good. The engineers did not deign to listen to the concerns of mere convicts, master stonemasons or no, but Ben might have saved him the whipping or the chains. "I know where there's gold to be found. Gold no one else knows about. Come with me and you can be rich. Rich enough to buy your passage home, and never work a day in your lives again. No more irons and no more lash ever." There was a darkness in the butcher's tone now, as if he recognized Torsten's pain. Perhaps he had. Plenty of convicts had been granted a pardon in the last 5 years. Everyone on Ben's ship had at least earned their ticket of leave. Except the 3 Stone brothers, still as much prisoners as the day they'd arrived. "More gold than you can imagine," the butcher crooned, a faraway look in his eyes. "Enough gold to buy their freedom and passage home? Maybe even enough for Ben to pay to learn to paint properly?" Ben shook his head. It was a dream, a false promise. No one else was listening to the butcher. Maybe everyone else knew he was a madman who said nothing but nonsense. "Nonsense," Ben said. "If you had that much gold, why would you share it with anyone? Slavery's illegal, old man, for that's what it would be for anyone who accepted your offer." "No, I would share it. There is enough for all those who help me protect it. I promise you," the butcher insisted. "Where is this gold?" Ben challenged him. "Victoria? They don't let convicts in there. You need papers for that." The butcher shuddered. "No, not Victoria. The gold is here. He stamped his foot on the road, as though it was buried beneath their feet. No one's found gold in Western Australia. I'd have heard about it if they had. Ben scoffed. He would too. Fremantle was as full of gossip as any village in Scotland. The butcher laid his finger beside his nose. Not if it is a secret that only I know. He glanced around, then dropped his voice. Meet me here at midnight on Sunday night, and I shall show you. He scanned the street one more time before hurrying inside his shop. Ben, what are you doing there? Get over here and help me with Tor. I think he needs to see the prison physician. Ben dutifully headed back to help Dunstan with their brother. Between them, they hauled him home to his hammock in Scott Buildings, his chains clinking ominously with every step. 4. Sunday dawned bright and sunny, a perfect summer's day if he'd been in Scotland. But it was winter in Fremantle, and the wind had a bite to it. Sadly, not a big enough bite to blow over the walls. Tor was still swaying about. Two of the warders' families were picnicking by the beach, while the older boys waded into the shallows with their fishing rods, declaring they would catch a shark for supper. Ben considered asking if the boys could fish somewhere else, or even just ignoring them. His painting was almost finished anyway. Finally, he decided the boys belonged where they were, both on the beach and in his painting. It would take longer to finish, but it wasn't like he wanted to go back to Scott Buildings anyway. Better that he work on this commission and enjoy a day in the sun. Watercolors suited the washed-out winter sky and the ships anchored in Gage Roads, the shipping channel that separated Fremantle from Rottnest Island, which he'd seen as a shadow on the horizon on clear days. Not today. He wished he had oils for the boys though, to better distinguish one from the other. As it was, they all looked alike, brushed into the landscape in browns, a foreground to the shingle-topped buildings across the bay. The commissariat held pride of place, with its blood-red sheer oak shingles rising above all others in town. It had been the first building he'd worked on with his brothers, but not the last. They'd built half the town from the streets up, including the soon-to-be-opened new prison. Not alone, of course, hundreds of other convicts had joined them, before getting their tickets of leave and heading out to find employment elsewhere in the colony. That looks lovely, a woman's voice said. Ben glanced over his shoulder to find one of the warder's wives standing not an arm's length from him, holding out a cup of tea. He took it, nodding his thanks to the woman. I've told John the first want him to hang it over the fireplace so I can see it every day, she continued. Especially with my boys in it. I never had a painting of my family before. I thought that was just for lords and ladies and things. Ah, so this was the wife of the warder who'd commissioned the piece. A brave woman, traveling halfway across the world with her husband to start a new life in a new colony. Like Pamela would have if she'd lived. Ben sighed. Pamela would have been in raptures, wanting to draw every waking moment she was here. She talked of finding gold too, just like the butcher. Maybe he wasn't so mad if someone as educated as she was knew gold was to be found here. If Pamela hadn't died, perhaps he would have come here with her and their children to paint and picnic, and if only he'd been home that night, instead of out with his brothers. Maybe he'd have been able to save her. If only. We should ask him to paint a wedding portrait of our Vicky when she gets married, one of the warders said. Vicky's only 7. He'll be long gone by the time she weds, his wife scoffed. Not this one or his brothers. Murderers, all 3 of them. They killed a woman back in Scotland. Right horrible murder it was, had even her lord father in tears when he talked about it before the magistrate, I heard. Men like him are the reason we're building that big new prison, with walls high enough to keep them in, away from our families. Some of the convicts serve their sentence and get pardoned, but the real bad apples like this one will be convicts for life. Can't trust them around normal, law-abiding folk. Don't know why they didn't just hang all of them instead of sending them all the way out here. The warder's wife had vanished, no longer brave enough to stand at Ben's side. Ben closed his eyes. Maybe he'd had enough sun for one day. "The painting is finished, sir," he said. "If you'd like to see it." The watercolor met with the warden's approval, and the warder was only too happy to take Ben back to the prisoner barracks, where he was issued with extra rations for the work. Ben merely tucked the bundle under his arm and went to find his brothers. 5. The convict barracks were empty but for the Stone brothers, and a guard posted by the door. Ben was surprised for a moment, until he remembered that the rest of the convicts had been sent on work parties out to York or Champion Bay, leaving space for the new shipload of convicts due to arrive any day. He'd wondered why they hadn't been added to one of the work parties, but now he had his answer. For all his dreams of freedom and his plans of one day meting out true justice to Pamela's murderer, he was doomed to die right here within the prison walls he and his brothers had built. He hoped Tor was right about the walls falling down in a storm, because there was no way they'd ever escape from this place otherwise. When the prison was finished, the inside of those walls was all he'd ever see. Forever. Dunstan had saved some dinner for him, which Ben ate quickly in between telling them what he'd heard at the beach. "We're going to die here. We've been building our own tomb," Ben finished. No response. Not one word from either of his brothers. "Well?" he asked. Dunstan shrugged. "If I could go back in time and you'd never looked at that girl." "Don't you blame Pamela for this. Even if I'd never met her or spoken a word to her, there's no saying that Lying Cove wouldn't have killed her anyway and still left her poor body in our house, or in the quarry or the castle, or somewhere that would have made us look guilty. Maybe if you two hadn't insisted we go out to see that oracle that night, Queen of the Kelpies or whatever she was, we'd have been home, and when she came to us for help, we could have defended her against that bastard, before all four of us took ship for this very colony, as free settlers instead of in chains." Ben kicked Tor's manacles, which jingled for a moment before they fell silent. Tor gave a shudder but said nothing. His eyes were glazed over, unseeing, but he didn't seem to have a fever. Ben looked askance at Dunstan. "That's our future. They've broken his spirit and you and me are next," Dunstan said. He sighed deeply, as though he'd already given up too. "No. Ben would not allow it. We have to escape. Before they lock us up in that prison forever. Escape while we still can. We should go meet with that butcher tonight. See what he has to offer." "The madman who was shouting in the street?" Dunstan shook his head. "Don't be a fool. We're fools if we stay here when we have a chance to escape. How long do you think Tor will last like this? We have to take our chance now before the walls are finished and they close the gates with us inside." Ben eyed Tor's manacles. "We'll have to get those chains off him, or they'll make too much noise and give us away." "We can't. What are they going to do to us if they catch us? We're already facing a lifetime in prison, which is no life at all. I say we go see the butcher. At least listen to what he has to say." Ben moved to the window. With only one guard, no one would be watching that. He'd be out the window and over the wall before anyone was the wiser. "No, wait, I'm coming with you," Dunstan said. "Bring Tor too." 6. A candle burned in the butcher shop window, so Ben knocked at the door, which opened at his touch. The butcher was expecting them then. "Come down to the cellar." The butcher beckoned from behind the counter. Ben and his brothers had no choice but to follow him down the stairs and between the shadowy carcasses that hung from the ceiling to what appeared to be a privy. The butcher put a finger to his lips before he lifted up the bench seat to reveal a ladder, leading down into the darkness. The brothers glanced at each other. A secret chamber beneath a cellar full of death? This did not bode well. "If the guards come past searching for you, they will not find you here. I'll be right down after you, I just need to get some refreshments," the butcher said, hurrying away. The sheep carcasses swayed in his wake. Dunstan shrugged. I'll go first. Tor, you come next, and if it's safe, Ben, you come down after. If it's not safe, you're the best one to go and fetch the guards. Because most of the guards believed Ben to be a good lad who'd been led astray by his brothers. If he were to tell the guards something villainous was going on beneath the butcher's shop, he'd actually be believed, instead of lashed or clapped in irons, like Tor or maybe even Dunstan. Which would be his brother's fate if they weren't hanged for trying to escape, even if Ben was let off lightly. Ben prayed the butcher's offer was genuine and their future would hold freedom. Ben! Come down! Dunstan hissed. But the butcher was almost back. He set his tea tray down on the floor. Would you take the biscuit tin while I carry the teapot? Ben held out his hand, tucked the biscuit tin under his arm and proceeded down the ladder. Dunstan could have built better than this rickety thing with his eyes closed, Ben thought as he made his way carefully down the crooked rungs. He was no carpenter and he could probably do better. But when he emerged into the cavern below, he began to understand why. The place looked like the bottom of a mineshaft, wooden beams propping up the cut stone ceiling and holding up the walls. There were even hand and footholds cut into the limestone wall behind the ladder, as though the ladder was a recent addition to the place. Shelves had been cut into the walls too to hold dusty boxes, their contents hidden under canvas covers. Tor and Dunstan sat on the ledge of a waist-high empty shelf, legs dangling, but when the butcher held up the teapot, they sprang into action. They shifted the table in the corner over to their shelf and dragged a bench along beside it, so they might all sit at table and have tea. The butcher produced cups from his pocket, and proceeded to pour generous servings. Ben set down the biscuit tin so that he might accept his cup. Drink, good sirs, and have a biscuit. Fresh from the bakery on Market Street, the butcher said airily, lifting the lid. Tor and Dunstan helped themselves, but Ben declined. He'd had his fill of them on the picnic by the beach, and they'd left a sour taste in his mouth. Tell us about this gold you found, Ben said, crossing his arms. Where in Western Australia did you find it? The butcher grinned. Why, it's right here, of course. He reached for one of the boxes and removed what Ben realized was not a cover, but a folded-over sack. Take a look for yourself. Gold nuggets tumbled out on the table, gleaming in the lantern light. Dunstan snatched up a fist-sized piece and bit into it, then grinned. It's gold all right. He reluctantly set the knobbly nugget back on the table with its fellows. Ben's gaze swept the table, measuring the size of the sack, before he counted the boxes lined up along the walls. If they're all full, that has to be close to 500 pounds of gold. And you found all that here, under your house? The butcher tapped his nose. If the governor only knew, eh? He'd have you convicts digging up the roads instead of building them. But that's why I need good stonecutters and carpenters. Strong men who know how to cut stone and shore it up, willing to work hard and keep my secret. Men who are good in a fight, who'll defend my gold like it's their own, because a part of it will be yours. A percentage of all the gold you dig up. What kind of percentage? Ben asked. Usually it would be Dunstan asking the questions, but since their arrest, his oldest brother had lost some of his spark, along with his heart, if what the man mumbled in his sleep was true. If we're doing all the work, it seems we should get no less than equal shares in this venture. A quarter share for each of us. The butcher laughed. That sounds fair. Let us shake on it. He held out his hand to Ben. Ben didn't want to take it. No one gave in that easily, not without bargaining. There was something wrong here. I would need it in writing, Ben said. The butcher produced parchment, a pen and ink, and Ben quickly wrote out the simple contract, then signed his name at the bottom, commanding his brothers to do the same, before pushing the paper toward the butcher. You too. William Silas Pierce scratched out his name, then handed the paper back to Ben. So we have a deal. Let's drink to it, eh? He seized the teapot and refilled Tor's and Dunstan's mugs. His own and Ben's were still full. All four of them raised their cups, clinked them together and drank. The tea tasted like tar, bitter as it coated his tongue before burning the back of his throat, all the way down. Ben gritted his teeth and drank it anyway. Tomorrow he would make sure he was in charge of brewing the tea properly, not this butcher. Pierce rose from his seat. I imagine you men might like a good night's sleep before you start work in the morning. The cellar is yours, no guard will think to look for you here. Ben glanced around. Where did the butcher expect them to sleep? There wasn't even a hammock, or anywhere suitable to hang one. No blankets. It might not be as cold as Scotland, but it was still winter in Fremantle, and the nights did have a chill to them. But Tor and Dunstan were already stretching out along the shelves, using their small sacks of belongings as pillows. They must be feigning sleep, so the butcher would leave and they could talk. Yes, that was it. Ben tucked the signed contract into his sketchbook, then buried it deep at the bottom of his sack, before setting it on an empty shelf for his pillow. He'd just lie down for a moment, until the butcher left them alone. Pierce tipped the contents of his own mug out on the floor. He hadn't drunk any of it, Ben realized, before collecting the cups and the teapot and heading up the ladder with them. He left the lantern on the table though. Ben waited until he could hear the man's footsteps dying away before following him up the ladder. The privy seat lifted easily. If they wanted to escape, they could. Which made no sense, for the butcher had left a whole bag of gold down there with them. With convicts. Whichever way Ben looked at it, none of this made sense. If there was gold to find in Fremantle, he and his brothers would have dug some up by now. If the nuggets were real, then they hadn't come from here. Maybe that's what the butcher wanted, free convict labor to build tunnels under Fremantle, where they wouldn't find any gold but would keep digging in hope of it. Pierce evidently thought they were idiots. Well, he'd show Pierce was the fool here, not him or his brothers. One sack of gold would set them up with farming land, just like they'd wanted. Perhaps not here, where their faces were too familiar, but maybe in Adelaide, or one of the other eastern colonies. Dunstan, Ben hissed, shaking his brother's shoulder. Dunstan only snored louder. He didn't wake. Nor did Tor, even when Ben shouted in his ear. That's when drowsiness began to steal his wits too, and he realized there must have been something in the tea. The tea Pierce had not drunk at all. Cursing, Ben barely made it to his makeshift bed before the drugged tea dragged him down into the darkness.